Welcome everyone. You're listening to an episode of Studio Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Lien Verpoest. I'm a professor of Eastern European History at the Faculty of Arts of KU Leuven. And I have a distinguished guest today, Professor Ria Laenen, who is working at the same university but at the Faculty of Social Sciences. Ria Laenen studied Eastern European Studies at KU Leuven, but also at University College London, and she wrote her PhD on Russia's policy towards its near abroad and its compatriots. She also spent several years as a researcher in the US and regularly gave guest lectures at Russian universities. Now, Ria is a lecturer at the Faculty of Social Sciences and teaches courses on Russian politics, geopolitical developments in the former Soviet countries, and the history of international politics since 1945. She regularly contributes to the Flemish media on current affairs related to Russia and the war in Ukraine. So welcome.
Thank you, Lien, for having me.
It's a lot that you've been doing and that you've been studying over the past decades, let's say, but I would like to talk to you today about your research on Eastern Europe, but also, let's say, placed in the broader international context, which is rapidly changing, as we know. So maybe to set us off in this conversation, I would like to ask, how did you actually develop your research focus on Eastern Europe, and how has this evolved specifically in the last very eventful decade, let's say?
Well, my research interest in Russia started already a long time ago, and it really started, I must say, with an interest in Russia itself, but then it soon broadened up to other former Soviet states. In the first place, I was really interested in doing research on what was called the frozen conflicts in the former Soviet Union. So specifically South Ossetia, Abkhazia, in Georgia have been a long time object of research for me. And then from there, I really became intrigued with how Russia formulates its policies towards these former Soviet states. And you see, I'm struggling with my words because I'm in this stage really trying to find the correct terminology to refer to that region that we now study. Is it Eastern Europe? Is it more specifically, if we speak about Georgia, for instance, necessary to speak about the Southern Caucasus? But then again, there are so many differences between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, for instance. So I'm looking for ways to develop the regional studies there and to pay enough attention to the agency of each of those states making up together the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, and this is also from the perspective that over the past decades we've maybe focused very much on Russia and not enough on the other post-Soviet states or Eastern European countries.
Exactly. So, for instance, I'm teaching a course that is called Russia and Eurasia in the Global Context, together with colleague Peter Vermeer. And one of the questions I've been asking to the students themselves is, do they think it is still a suited title for the course? And if not, which other names they would suggest? And opinions are very divided, I must say. But I really agree the field of study has been dominated by a focus on Russia itself. And now it's more than time to decolonize the field of studies, I think.
Yeah, and I think this is something that has been set into motion and has opened many interesting new avenues to research. But I think what is also very interesting about your work is that you not only study this region, but you also teach international politics since 1945. And you, let's say, are very able to place what is going on in Eastern Europe, especially the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, into the broader international context. You've also written a book on this topic, a very successful book, and so I would like to hear from you if you could tell us why you wrote the book, but also what the main message is of this book and its title.
Well, the book is titled, translated from the Dutch title, which is Een heel klein beetje vrede, a little bit of peace, a tiny little bit of peace. And it has been, I must say, for a long time in the pipeline, this book. But maybe it was meant to be, and now it is very much a timely publication, I think. Why I wrote it? I wrote it in the first instance for the students of that course. That is my main target audience for the book. But then while doing that, me and also the publisher were thinking, well, there might be an audience outside of academia, outside of the students themselves, who are also interested in getting more insights in how the international politics evolved since the Second World War. Because I think we in academia often assume that many things are known by everyone, but my teaching experience, especially to first-year students, shows that, for instance, their historical knowledge on what has happened in other parts of the world is quite limited. We have a very strong Western European focus in our common knowledge, and I think that is understandable and it's happening everywhere in the world. But broadening that lens through which we look at international political developments to other parts of the world is one of the main reasons why I have written the book.
Also, it might be interesting to know your book, as we just said, is very relevant in this because the world is rapidly changing. I think there is not a day right now that passes where we are surprised about what is being said by Trump or Vance, by how Ukraine and Europe or the European Union try to counter this. The Russian side, many people think that right now we are really at a crossroads in history. Many people write opinion articles saying that the situation is very serious. We need to change our views on the reality of international politics. So there is a lot going on. What is your take on this? Do you really think we are at a crossroads in history?
Well, my short answer to that is time will tell. I think it's too early to jump to conclusions already. That being said, I think that we indeed are witnessing a change in the world order, but that, in my opinion, is not something that has just started now by the Trump administration, for instance. I think that is a process that has been gradually ongoing for a couple of years at least already, and in which players like China, like Russia, are trying to undermine some of the foundations that mostly Western countries have laid out after the Second World War, and now, they are trying to challenge that world order as we know it. But again, it's not something new. It's happening gradually, and it is definitely not only Russia that is playing a role in that.
Yeah, because you just mentioned China and US trying to change, but then you say it's also not something new. Do you then mean that it has started already in 2008 or 2014 or Trump's first legislature, 2016?
I find it very hard to pinpoint an exact moment when that process started. I think it possibly started already shortly after in the Western world, very well known 9/11. So I think there are many possible events that we could point out as this is an indication of the start of that process, but definitely what China and Russia have been doing, for instance, on the African continent, is something that has been overlooked for a long time, and mainly by European states has been overlooked for a very long time, and only now is fully in the picture because now we connect it to other things that are happening in the world. So it is also an exercise of looking back and trying to find there indications of that process that has started already.
And if we then look at Russia's foreign policy this is also something you've been studying since 1991. There was Yeltsin and the Yeltsin period, which I think now is generally considered as an anomaly in Russian foreign policy. Putin, who became president in 2000, has become president again and will be president for a very long time, I gather. How do you estimate, especially Putin's policy or the current Russian foreign policy towards Europe? Because there, My perception is that a lot has changed or has become much more explicit. But if you look at it from 1991 to now, have we been blind, or should we have been more attentive, or what has changed in Russia's foreign policy?
Wow, that is a very interesting question. And I think maybe just taking some distance from the figure of Putin itself is also necessary. When you look at the Russian policy documents themselves, many of the ideas that you now see as key elements of Russia's foreign policy were already there in the foreign policy documents before Putin entered at the political stage. So already from the mid-1990s, you see some at least expression of frustration about the relationship between Russia and Europe, and frustration especially about not being treated as equal partner, but more being viewed as a pupil in the school class that has to just take the lessons that the West dictates. And that, I think, is a very important source of frustration on which Putin's policies have been building in the decades afterwards. Also claiming the so-called near abroad, being the former Soviet states minus the Baltic states, we could say, well, there is discussion about that, were already very present in those policy documents from mid-1990s, saying by Russia, this is what we claim as a zone of special interests where third actors, well, basically have nothing to say. But at that time, we were not blind, I think, but we were thinking, well, Russia is weak. Russia is not the player it used to be. So, well, it is perhaps there in their policy documents, but they are not able to really put that into practical policies. And that is a mistake we made, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you talk about frustration. 2014 may have been, I think, the biggest critical juncture, as we say, because there, probably in the perception of Putin, the EU crossed the line by trying to sign an association agreement with Ukraine, a free trade agreement. Then Ukraine opted out, Euromaidan happened, etc. Do you see this as a new stage where there are new concepts also rising in Russia's foreign policy? For example, I'm talking about the whole discourse on humiliation. Is it something that you see being actively used in Russia's policy towards the EU specifically, or do you see other trends?
Well, it's one of the concepts that it's actively used indeed, humiliation. What is for me very interesting also when I was, for instance, teaching guest lectures at Russian universities, is that when I was speaking to young people, also people who were very critical of Putin's regime internally in Russia about the lack of democratic freedoms, etc., many of them were highly in favor of the annexation of Crimea, for instance. Yes. And they often formulated as it was not an annexation, it was correcting a historical mistake, referring to what happened in 1954. So you see that Putin knew that he would play into feelings that are resonating with the Russian audience. So it's humiliation, but it is also, I would rather think, the concept of being recognized as a great power is the leading theme in Russian foreign policy, and they have been trying it in many ways, but in the end have chosen to do it by the means of force, blatant military force.
Yeah, and maybe if we think about perceptions, this actually has worked, because for such a long time, there was this, I think, indeed, frustration about not being legitimized, not being seen as an equal actor, always being seen as a former superpower, at most a regional power. This is a discourse, I think, that has been present since the fall of the Soviet Union, implosion of the Soviet Union. Russia's economy and military prowess has been, I think, consistently underestimated over the past decades, whereas I think also since 2008 there has been a very strong military buildup. But now Russia has a seat at the table, is being heard, is being perceived again as a superpower, although you could say they're still struggling at the front line in Ukraine. So there is some kind of contradiction.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and speaking of superpowers, that's one of the points I make in the book, that I think the age of superpowers is over. There are no longer, I think, superpowers in the traditional understanding of that word. And Russia really tries to be one of the great powers, but in a way it is there out of the league, you know. According to many parameters, Russia is not such a strong player. And now exactly the opposite of what has happened in the past, I think, is happening, you know. While in the 1990s we underestimated Russia, we wrote it off as weak, now we do exactly the opposite. We maybe see it too much as a strong player, while Russia itself know that when compared to China, for instance, they are a very junior player, but they really make a lot of effort to project that image, and indeed perception matters in international politics, that they are on equal terms with other great powers, which in the facts it is not.
No. Then maybe to conclude this conversation, I won't ask you what road ahead you see for Ukraine, because I think that's an impossible question to answer. But I would like to ask you to reflect by writing the book. You've studied or you've really concentrated on international political situations since 1945. Is the conflict, or what is going on right now, is it exceptional? Or do you really think that it will influence the geopolitical balance in the world to an extent that has not happened before?
I definitely don't want to downplay the importance of the war in Ukraine. At the same time, we again should be aware of the fact that for many parts of the world, this is a conflict not really on their radar. I speak, for instance, of India, of large chunks of Latin America, Africa. People there think, well, it is just one of the many conflicts in the world. So, yes, for us in Europe, it is definitely a defining moment.
Yes.
And that's exactly why I think Europe has the task to take up more responsibility. We cannot afford to let others, for whom perhaps it is an irrelevant conflict, to decide what the outcome is going to be. I think especially also in the United States of America, that is the main view now with large parts of the population, that, well, Ukraine, it is dossier, so to speak, that has to be solved by others, not by us. So again, it is up to us in Europe to take up that task. And how exceptional it is, well, I've been thinking a lot lately about what happened 80 years ago at the Yalta conference, when the so-called Big Three came together. Yeah. And they decided on redrawing borders in Central Eastern Europe without consulting the people themselves, just over the heads of the people living in Poland, in Ukraine, and other parts of Central Eastern Europe. And the long-lasting effects of those decisions that have been taken at that time, some of them which still apply nowadays and still play a role in international politics. And I'm afraid it's a kind of not exactly the same happening, but at least a recurring pattern that again, great powers are trying to decide over the heads of the nations in Central and Eastern Europe what their future will be.
So we might be moving towards a new Yalta moment, I think.
Yeah, maybe that is one of the possible scenarios.
Okay, well, Ria, thank you for this extremely interesting conversation, and many congratulations also on your book.
Thank you.